The mahogany casket hovered above the grave, suspended by silk straps, as 200 mourners in black stood silent under the autumn sun. Beverly Whitmore, tech billionaire, philanthropist, dead at 43, was about to disappear into the earth. Then a man in a dirt-stained cemetery uniform broke through the crowd, his work boots scattering rose petals across marble headstones. "She's not dead." Trevor Hayes' voice cracked the silence like a gunshot. "Don't bury her. She's still alive." Security lunged forward. The crowd gasped. Cameras turned. But Trevor didn't run. He stood there, a single father who cleaned graves for a living, pointing at the casket with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of knowing something everyone else refused to see. Inside that polished box, a woman's heart was still beating. The man who put her there was standing right beside the grave, wearing a widower's tears like a mask. What happens when the poorest man at a funeral becomes the only one telling the truth? The mourning had started like any other funeral at Riverside Memorial. Trevor Hayes had arrived at dawn to prepare the gravesite, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had dug too many holes in the earth. The autumn air bit at his skin through the worn fabric of his uniform, but he barely noticed anymore. Cold was just another thing you learned to live with when you worked outdoors for minimum wage and slept in the maintenance shed because rent in the city had become a luxury, reserved for people who didn't have a sick daughter depending on them. He had spread fresh grass clippings around the grave, positioned the lowering device, and retreated to his usual spot behind the maintenance building, where cemetery workers were expected to remain invisible during services. That was the unspoken rule. The living could grieve, but those who served the dead should never be seen. But Trevor had seen something 2 nights ago that he couldn't unsee. He had been making his rounds past midnight, checking that all the gates were locked, when he heard voices near the storage facility, where funeral homes kept caskets before burial. 2 men stood in the shadows, their silhouettes sharp against the security light. One wore an expensive suit even at that hour. The other had the bearing of someone used to giving orders in quiet rooms where decisions were made that would never appear in any official record. Trevor had frozen, his instinct for survival telling him to turn around and walk away, to pretend he had seen nothing. Men like that didn't appreciate witnesses. "The drug worked exactly as promised," the suited man had said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of someone checking off a task. "She's in a state of suspended animation. Heart rate so slow it won't register on standard equipment. Body temperature dropped to match ambient conditions. To any medical examiner working quickly, she'll appear completely dead." The other man had replied with clinical detachment. "The toxin will metabolize completely within 72 hours. No trace. But she needs to be buried before then, Kenneth. If anyone runs specialized tests or keeps her in observation longer, they'll notice the inconsistencies." Kenneth. Trevor had pressed himself against the cold brick wall, his breath held until his lungs burned. Kenneth Whitmore, Beverly Whitmore's husband, the man who had stood on television 2 days ago with tears streaming down his face, begging for privacy during his family's time of grief. Trevor should have walked away. He should have gone back to his shed, locked the door, and told himself that whatever happened in the world of billionaires and corporate empires was none of his business. A man who cleaned graves for a living didn't challenge people who owned buildings with their names on them. But Trevor had a daughter. Josie was 9 years old, born with a congenital heart defect that required constant monitoring and medication that cost more per month than Trevor made in 3. He knew what it meant to watch someone you loved struggle for every breath, to feel helpless as their body betrayed them. And he knew what it meant to make impossible choices when the person you loved most in the world was running out of time. 6 months ago, he had taken Josie to Mercy General for one of her regular checkups. They had sat in the waiting room for 3 hours because their insurance was the kind that got you seen eventually, not promptly. Josie had been tired, her lips taking on that bluish tint that made Trevor's heart clench with fear. A woman had sat down next to them, elegant even in casual clothes, and had noticed Josie's medical bracelet. "Heart condition?" she had asked gently. Trevor had nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The woman had smiled at Josie and said something that Trevor would carry with him forever. "You know what I learned about hearts," she had told his daughter. "They're stronger than people think. They keep fighting, even when everything else wants to give up. Never give up on the ones you love, sweetheart. Sometimes all they need is someone to believe they're still worth fighting for." That woman had been Beverly Whitmore. Trevor hadn't known it then, had only recognized her face 2 days ago when the news reported her sudden death from a heart attack. The same heart condition Josie had, the same condition that had apparently killed a woman who had just passed her annual physical with perfect results, who had been photographed jogging in the park 3 days before her death, who had been scheduled to testify before a congressional committee about corporate fraud in the pharmaceutical industry the following week. The same testimony that would have implicated her husband's investment firm in a scheme to artificially inflate drug prices for cardiac medications. Trevor had read about it in the newspaper someone had left in the break room, his hand shaking as the pieces fell into place like dominoes arranged for inevitable collapse. So when Beverly Whitmore's funeral procession had arrived that morning, when Trevor had watched Kenneth Whitmore play the devastated widower for the cameras, when he had seen the casket being positioned above the grave with unseemly haste, he had made a decision. Maybe it was the memory of Beverly's kindness to a stranger's sick child. Maybe it was the thought of Josie asking him every night if he had helped anyone that day, her voice carrying the innocent belief that her father was someone who made the world better. Maybe it was just that Trevor Hayes had spent too many years being invisible, being powerless, being the kind of person that men like Kenneth Whitmore never even saw when they walked past. Whatever the reason, when the minister began the final prayer, Trevor had stepped out from behind the maintenance building and walked toward the grave. The security guard reached him first, a thick-armed man in a black suit who grabbed Trevor's shoulder with enough force to leave bruises. "Sir, you need to leave immediately." Trevor twisted free, his years of physical labor giving him a wiry strength that surprised them both. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rising above the confused murmur of the crowd. "Beverly Whitmore is not dead. She's been poisoned with a drug that mimics death. If you bury her now, you're murdering her." The crowd's murmur became a wave of shock. Cameras that had been respectfully lowered suddenly swung in his direction. Kenneth Whitmore's face went from grief-stricken to furious in the span of a heartbeat. "This man is clearly disturbed," Kenneth said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to controlling narratives. "Security, remove him now." But an older woman pushed through the crowd, her elegant black dress and pearls marking her as someone of status. "Wait," she said sharply. "I'm Ruth Whitmore, Beverly's aunt." "Young man, what exactly are you claiming?" Trevor met her eyes and saw something there he recognized. Doubt. The same doubt that had been gnawing at her, the same questions about a death that had been too sudden, too convenient, too perfectly timed to silence her niece before that congressional testimony. "I'm Trevor Hayes. I manage this cemetery. 2 nights ago, I overheard Kenneth Whitmore and a man named Garrett Walsh discussing how they had used a drug called tetrodotoxin to put Beverly in a state of suspended animation. They plan to bury her before the drug wears off, and anyone realizes she's still alive." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Kenneth lunged forward, his mask of grief completely shattered. "This is insane. This man is a conspiracy theorist who—" Ruth held up her hand, silencing him with the authority of someone who had been making decisions long before Kenneth was born. "If what he's saying is true, we lose nothing by checking. If it's false, we can proceed and have this man arrested. But if there's even a chance my niece is alive in that casket, I will not let her be buried without being absolutely certain. She turned to the funeral director, a thin man who had gone pale. "Open the casket." The funeral director looked at Kenneth, who shook his head violently. "This is desecration. I won't allow it. Beverly deserves to rest in peace, not be subjected to—" Ruth's voice cut through like a blade. "You don't get to make this decision, Kenneth. The family does. And I'm saying, open it now." Trevor felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had gambled everything on this moment. If he was wrong, if Beverly was truly dead, and this was just the paranoid conclusion of a man who had spent too many nights alone with his thoughts, he would be arrested, fired, and lose any chance of keeping his job and the pitiful health insurance that kept Josie's prescriptions affordable. But if he was right, if Beverly was in that casket fighting for every slow breath while her husband counted down the minutes until she was buried alive, then speaking up was the only choice his conscience would allow him to make. The funeral director's hands shook as he approached the casket. The silk straps were released, and the mahogany box settled onto the grass with a soft thump that seemed to echo across the cemetery. The crowd pressed closer, a mass of expensive perfume and morbid curiosity. Trevor pushed through them, ignoring the hands that tried to hold him back. "Let me through," he said. "I need to check her vital signs." A man in a doctor's coat stepped forward, his face arranged in professional concern. "I'm Dr. Garrett Walsh, the Whitmore family physician. I examined Beverly myself and signed the death certificate. There's no need for this circus. The woman is deceased." Trevor recognized the name immediately. This was the other voice from that night, the clinical one that had discussed burial timelines, like they were scheduling a business lunch. "Then you won't mind if I check," Trevor said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He knelt beside the casket as the funeral director opened the lid with the reverent slowness of someone performing a sacred ritual. Beverly Whitmore lay inside, her skin pale against white silk, her hands folded across her chest in the eternal pose of the dead. She looked exactly as a corpse should look, still, cold, absent of any spark that marked the difference between a body and a person. For a terrible moment, Trevor thought he had been wrong, that his paranoid fantasy had led him to make a fool of himself at a billionaire's funeral. Then he saw it. The tiny flutter at the base of her throat, so faint it was almost invisible. The slight discoloration under her fingernails that suggested not death, but profound oxygen deprivation. The way her chest, if you watched carefully enough, seemed to move with respirations so shallow they barely qualified as breathing. Trevor had spent 6 months learning everything he could about Josie's condition, reading medical journals in the public library, watching videos about cardiac arrest and resuscitation. He knew what death looked like, and this wasn't it. This was someone barely clinging to life, suspended in a chemical twilight that mimicked death closely enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the signs. "She's breathing," Trevor said, his voice cracking with relief and horror. "Her respirations are maybe 2 per minute, but she's breathing. Someone call an ambulance. Now." Dr. Walsh moved forward quickly. "That's impossible. I examined her myself. This man doesn't know what he's talking about. He's clearly suffering from some kind of—" Trevor pulled out his phone and held it up, the screen showing a recording app that had been running since he stepped forward. "I have a recording of Kenneth Whitmore and Dr. Garrett Walsh discussing this exact scenario 2 nights ago. Everything they said about the drug, the timing, the burial schedule. It's all right here." The cemetery fell silent except for the autumn wind rustling through the trees. Kenneth Whitmore's face had gone from red to white, the color draining as he realized the trap closing around him. Dr. Walsh took a step backward, his professional composure crumbling. Ruth Whitmore stared at her nephew-in-law with an expression of dawning horror. "Kenneth," she whispered, "what have you done?" Kenneth seemed to realize in that moment that he had lost. The carefully constructed tragedy he had orchestrated was collapsing around him, and the only way forward was through complete denial or complete confession. He chose a third option: escalation. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "She was supposed to be dead by now," he said, his voice cracking with frustration and rage. "She was supposed to stop causing problems, stop threatening to expose everything, stop being so righteous about her precious ethics. I gave her everything: status, wealth, a place in my world, and she wanted to throw it all away to testify against pharmaceutical companies that fund half the medical research in this country. She was going to destroy us both, and for what? So a few poor people could afford their medications?" He moved toward the casket, the syringe held like a weapon. "This should have been over. But if she's going to wake up, then I'll finish it properly this time." Trevor didn't think. He threw himself between Kenneth and the casket, his body acting on instinct before his mind could calculate the danger. Kenneth swung the syringe toward him, and Trevor caught his wrist. The two men struggling as the crowd erupted into chaos. Security guards who had been trying to remove Trevor moments before now rushed to pull Kenneth away. The syringe fell to the grass, its contents spilling onto the flowers that had been meant to decorate Beverly's grave. Ruth Whitmore was on her phone, her voice sharp and commanding as she called for police and ambulances. Dr. Walsh tried to run, but two of the younger mourners caught him at the cemetery gate, tackling him to the ground with the enthusiasm of people who had just witnessed attempted murder and were eager to play hero. Trevor knelt beside Beverly's casket again, his hands shaking as he checked her pulse. It was there, thready and weak, but unmistakably present. "Come on," he whispered. "You told my daughter that hearts are stronger than people think. Prove it. Keep fighting." He had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but he knew that if Beverly was suffering from tetrodotoxin poisoning, she needed oxygen and careful monitoring until the drug metabolized. He tilted her head back slightly, making sure her airway was clear, and looked up at the crowd of shocked mourners. "Does anyone have oxygen? A medical kit? Anything?" A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her hands clutching a small emergency medical bag. "I'm a paramedic. I came because Beverly funded our station's new ambulance." She knelt beside Trevor, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked Beverly's vital signs and administered oxygen through a small portable mask. "You were right," she said quietly. "Her heart rate is about 15 beats per minute. Blood pressure is dangerously low, but she's alive." Barely, but alive. The sound of sirens grew louder, and within minutes the cemetery was flooded with police officers and EMTs. Beverly was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, the oxygen mask now connected to a proper tank, her body wrapped in warming blankets as the paramedics worked to stabilize her condition. Ruth Whitmore approached Trevor as the police led Kenneth and Dr. Walsh away in handcuffs. Her eyes were wet with tears, but her voice was steady. "You saved my niece's life. A man we never met, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Saved her life when her own husband tried to murder her." Trevor shook his head, suddenly exhausted. "I just did what was right. Anyone would have." Ruth's laugh was bitter. "No, young man. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. But you didn't. Why?" Trevor thought about Josie, about the way she looked at him every morning like he was the bravest person in the world, about the promise he had made to himself that he would never let his daughter down by being the kind of man who stood by while others suffered. "Because someone once told my daughter that you should never give up on the ones you love," Trevor said simply. "Your niece said that. She didn't know us, had no reason to care about a sick little girl in a hospital waiting room. But she took the time to be kind anyway. I couldn't let someone like that die when I had the power to stop it." Ruth nodded slowly, then reached out and took his hand. "What's your name?" she asked. Trevor Hayes. She squeezed his hand gently. Trevor Hayes, when Beverly wakes up, I'm going to make sure she knows exactly who you are and what you did, and I suspect she's going to want to thank you properly. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, media attention, and a criminal investigation that unfolded like something from a legal thriller. Trevor was questioned for hours about what he had heard, what he had seen, and why he had waited until the funeral to speak up. He explained over and over that he had spent those 2 days trying to convince himself he had misunderstood, that he was being paranoid, that men like Kenneth Whitmore didn't actually murder their wives for money and power. The detective interviewing him had nodded with weary understanding. Rich people crimes, she had said. They're always the hardest to believe until the evidence makes it impossible to deny. The evidence in this case was overwhelming. The syringe Kenneth had dropped contained a lethal dose of concentrated tetrodotoxin. Security footage from the cemetery showed Kenneth and Dr. Walsh meeting near the storage facility, exactly as Trevor had described. Phone records revealed dozens of calls between Kenneth and Walsh in the weeks before Beverly's supposed death. Financial records showed that Kenneth had made a series of investments that would have been catastrophically bad if Beverly's congressional testimony had gone forward, but would become enormously profitable if she was unable to testify. And Beverly herself, once the drug had fully metabolized from her system and she had regained consciousness in a hospital bed surrounded by monitors and guards, confirmed what Trevor had suspected. She remembered the dinner party where she had felt suddenly, inexplicably ill. She remembered Kenneth helping her to bed, his face concerned and loving, his hands gentle as he gave her what he said was medication for her heart. She remembered the sensation of her body shutting down, of trying to scream but finding her muscles wouldn't respond, of hearing Kenneth and Dr. Walsh discussing her funeral arrangements while she lay paralyzed and helpless on their bed. I was conscious for all of it, Beverly told Trevor when he finally visited her in the hospital, his hands clutching a small bouquet of flowers he had bought from the hospital gift shop because he didn't know what else to bring a woman he had pulled from her grave. I heard everything. I felt them preparing my body for burial, felt the cold of the embalming fluid they didn't actually inject, because Walsh told the funeral home that I had requested no embalming for religious reasons. I was screaming inside my own head while they dressed me in burial clothes and sealed me in that casket. When you shouted that I wasn't dead, I wanted to cry with relief. But I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. I could only wait and hope that someone would believe you. Trevor sat in the chair beside her bed, feeling awkward and out of place in this private hospital room that probably cost more per day than his monthly salary. I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner, he said. I should have gone to the police the moment I heard them talking. If I had been braver, you wouldn't have gone through all of that. Beverly shook her head weakly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. If you had gone to the police, Kenneth would have denied everything. A cemetery worker with no proof against one of the wealthiest men in the state? They would have dismissed you as a conspiracy theorist. But by waiting until the funeral, by having witnesses and cameras present, you made it impossible for him to escape. You didn't just save my life, Trevor. You made sure justice would be served. They sat in silence for a moment, the monitors beeping steadily in the background. Finally, Beverly spoke again, her voice curious. Why did you do it? You could have lost everything. Your job, your freedom if Kenneth had managed to turn it around on you. Why risk all of that for a stranger? Trevor thought about how to explain it, how to put into words the complicated mixture of conscience and memory and desperation that had driven him to act. You were kind to my daughter once, he said finally. Josie has the same heart condition you do. We were at the hospital for one of her checkups, and you sat with us for a few minutes. You told her that hearts are stronger than people think, that she should never give up on the ones she loves. She talks about that all the time now. When things are hard, When she's scared about her condition, she remembers what you said." Beverly's eyes filled with tears. "I remember," she said softly. "A little girl with a medical bracelet and the bravest smile I'd ever seen. And her father, who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." Trevor nodded, his throat tight. "That's Josie. She's 9 years old, and she believes I'm some kind of hero because I'm her dad, and I take care of her. I couldn't let her down by being the kind of person who knew someone was in danger and did nothing. What kind of father would that make me? What kind of person?" Beverly smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "It makes you exactly the kind of father she thinks you are, and exactly the kind of person this world needs more of." The trial of Kenneth Whitmore and Dr. Garrett Walsh became a national sensation. The media dubbed it the burial plot, and every detail was dissected by legal analysts and true crime enthusiasts. Kenneth's defense team tried to argue that he had been under psychological duress, that Beverly's planned testimony would have destroyed not just his business, but his entire social standing. They painted him as a desperate man driven to temporary insanity by the prospect of losing everything he had worked for. The prosecution's response was devastating in its simplicity. Kenneth Whitmore had chosen money and reputation over his wife's life. He had planned her murder with cold calculation, had watched her being prepared for burial knowing she was still alive, and had attempted to finish the job when his plan was exposed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Dr. Garrett Walsh received a similar sentence, his medical license permanently revoked, and his name becoming synonymous with the worst kind of ethical violation. In his statement before sentencing, he tried to explain his actions as misguided loyalty to a friend. The judge had interrupted him. "You're a doctor," she had said, her voice cold with disgust. "You took an oath to do no harm. You used your medical knowledge and authority to help orchestrate the murder of a patient who trusted you. There is no explanation that makes that acceptable." Walsh had lowered his head, and Trevor, watching from the gallery, had felt no satisfaction in seeing him broken. Justice wasn't supposed to feel empty, but somehow it did. In the months that followed, Trevor's life changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Beverly, once she had fully recovered, had insisted on meeting Josie. The three of them had dinner at a quiet restaurant. And Trevor had watched his daughter and the woman he had saved talk about hearts and courage and the importance of standing up for what was right. Beverly had asked Josie what she wanted to be when she grew up, and Josie had answered without hesitation. "A doctor who helps kids with hearts like mine." Beverly had looked at Trevor, her eyes communicating something he understood without words. She was going to make sure Josie had that chance. The next week, Beverly had called Trevor and asked him to meet her at the headquarters of Vantage Industries, the technology company she had built from nothing. He had taken the bus downtown, his hands sweating in his only suit, and had been escorted to an executive office with views of the entire city. Beverly had been sitting behind a desk, looking every inch the billionaire CEO she was, but her smile had been warm and genuine. "I have a proposition for you," she had said. "I need someone I can trust absolutely. Someone who has proven they have integrity, even when it costs them everything. Someone who isn't motivated by money, or status, or power. I need you to come work for me." Trevor had stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. "As what?" "I manage cemeteries. I don't have any business experience or technology skills, or—" Beverly had held up her hand, stopping him. "You have something more important than any of that. You have character. And you have more technology skills than you think. Ruth did some research into your background. You were a biomedical engineer before you lost your job in the economic downturn. You have patents on 3 different medical devices. You're exactly the kind of person I need, helping me evaluate the ethical implications of the technology we develop and the partners we choose to work with." It had been an offer Trevor couldn't refuse, though he had tried. He had argued that he wasn't qualified, that he would embarrass her, that people would think she was just paying him back for saving her life. Beverly had listened patiently, then had said the words that finally convinced him. "Your daughter is watching you, Trevor. Every day, she's learning from your example what it means to be brave, to be ethical, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Don't teach her that opportunities should be refused because you don't think you deserve them. Teach her that when someone offers you a chance to do meaningful work and support your family, you have the courage to take it." So Trevor had accepted. He had given notice at the cemetery, packed up his few belongings from the maintenance shed, and moved with Josie into a small apartment that had real heating and didn't smell like industrial cleaner. He had started work at Vantage Industries as a special advisor to the CEO, a title that made him laugh every time he saw it on his office door. His job was to attend meetings, ask uncomfortable questions, and make sure that the company's drive for profit never came at the expense of ethics or safety. It was strange work for someone who had spent years being invisible, but Trevor discovered he had a talent for seeing problems that others overlooked and asking the questions that no one else wanted to voice. The first major test came during a pitch meeting with a pharmaceutical company that wanted to partner with Vantage on a new drug delivery system. The executives had presented impressive data about efficiency and market penetration, but something about their numbers hadn't added up. Trevor had interrupted the presentation, ignoring the annoyed looks from some of the Vantage board members. "These cost projections assume pricing that would make the treatment unaffordable for about 60% of patients who need it," he had said. "Is that an acceptable trade-off for market share?" The room had gone silent. The pharmaceutical executives had tried to redirect the conversation, but Trevor had pressed harder. "My daughter needs cardiac medications to survive. I know what it's like to choose between rent and prescriptions." Are we really going to develop technology that makes that choice even harder for families like mine? Beverly had ended the meeting shortly after, and the partnership had fallen through. Some of the board members had been furious, accusing Trevor of costing the company millions in potential revenue. Beverly had stood firm. "Trevor did exactly what I hired him to do," she had told them. "He reminded us that not everything worth doing is profitable, and not everything profitable is worth doing. If you can't accept that, you're welcome to resign from the board." No one had resigned, and in the following months, Trevor's approach had become part of Vantage's corporate culture. The company had gained a reputation for ethical innovation, which had attracted a different kind of investor and partner, ones who were willing to accept slightly lower returns in exchange for being associated with a company that actually cared about doing good in the world. Trevor had settled into his new life with the cautious optimism of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune too easily. He worked hard, arrived early, and stayed late, determined to prove that Beverly's faith in him wasn't misplaced. He made sure Josie never missed a doctor's appointment, and with the health insurance from Vantage, her medications became affordable instead of catastrophic. He watched his daughter grow stronger, saw color return to her cheeks, and energy return to her step. On her 10th birthday, she had run a full mile without stopping, something the doctors had said might never be possible. Trevor had cried watching her, overwhelmed by the simple joy of seeing his child be a child instead of a patient. But there was something else growing alongside his professional success, and Josie's improving health, something Trevor tried not to acknowledge because it felt inappropriate and presumptuous. He was falling in love with Beverly Whitmore. It happened slowly, in moments he couldn't quite pinpoint. The way she listened when he talked about Josie, her face soft with genuine interest. The way she laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't particularly funny. The way she treated him like an equal, despite the vast difference in their wealth and status. The way she remembered small details about his life, his favorite coffee order, the fact that he hated meetings before 8 in the morning. The names of all his daughter's doctors and teachers. He tried to convince himself it was gratitude, or admiration, or simply the natural result of working closely with someone remarkable. But late at night, alone in his apartment while Josie slept, Trevor would remember the way Beverly's hand had felt in his when she thanked him at the hospital, and he would know the truth. He was in love with her, deeply and completely, in a way that terrified him because it seemed impossible that someone like her could ever see him as anything more than the man who had saved her life and now worked for her company. She was a billionaire, a genius, a woman who moved in circles where people owned islands and had their names on museum wings. He was a former cemetery worker whose greatest accomplishment before meeting her had been keeping his daughter alive on a poverty-level income. Beverly, for her part, was dealing with her own complicated feelings. The trauma of Kenneth's betrayal had left scars that went deeper than the physical effects of the poisoning. She had nightmares about being trapped in the casket, about trying to scream and having no voice, about being lowered into the ground while people she loved stood above her grave and talked about what a tragedy it was that she was gone. She saw a therapist twice a week, working through the trust issues that came from having your husband try to murder you for money. Her therapist had asked her if she could ever imagine trusting another man enough to be vulnerable with them, and Beverly had answered honestly, maybe one. Just one. She found herself watching Trevor during meetings, admiring the way he refused to be intimidated by executives who had decades more experience. She loved his dedication to Josie, the way his entire face lit up when he talked about his daughter's latest accomplishment or funny observation. She appreciated his humility, how he never bragged about saving her life or used it as social currency the way so many people in her position would have. He treated her rescue as something anyone would have done, not as a heroic act that made him special. And she was drawn to his integrity, the absolute core of decency that made him ask uncomfortable questions and refuse to compromise on matters of ethics, even when it would have been easier and more profitable to stay silent. Beverly had never been good at hiding her feelings. She had built $1 billion company by being direct, by saying what she wanted and pursuing it with single-minded determination. But with Trevor, she hesitated. She didn't want him to feel obligated to return feelings that might just be born of gratitude. She didn't want to complicate their working relationship or make him uncomfortable. And she definitely didn't want to scare him away by being too forward, too intense, too much in the way that past partners had sometimes accused her of being. So she held back, keeping things professional even as her heart raced every time he smiled at her or their hands accidentally brushed when reaching for the same document. The turning point came 6 months after Trevor had started working at Vantage. The company had landed a major contract to develop medical monitoring devices for underserved communities, a project that would bring in substantial revenue while actually helping people who desperately needed better healthcare access. To celebrate, Beverly had organized a company dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Trevor had attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with the formal setting and expensive food, but determined to support the team that had worked so hard on the proposal. He had worn the same suit he had worn to his first meeting with Beverly, and he had spent the evening mostly quiet, listening to others celebrate and feeling out of place among people who casually discussed vacation homes and private school tuition. Beverly had noticed his discomfort and had made her way to his side as the dinner was winding down. "Want to get out of here?" she had asked quietly. "We can walk along the river. The restaurant is nice, but it's not really my scene either." Trevor had looked at her in surprise. "I thought you loved places like this. You own places like this." She had laughed. "I invest in them. That doesn't mean I enjoy eating $20 appetizers while people talk about their stock portfolios. Come on, let's go somewhere real." They had slipped out while everyone else was distracted by dessert, walking along the riverfront in the cool evening air. The city lights reflected off the water, and for the first time in months, Trevor had felt like he could breathe properly. They had walked in comfortable silence for a while before Beverly spoke. "Can I ask you something personal?" Trevor had nodded, his hands shoved in his pockets against the chill. Do you ever regret it? Stepping forward at the funeral, I mean. You could have walked away, kept your quiet life, avoided all the media attention and the trial and the complications. Do you wish you had? Trevor had thought about it seriously before answering. No, he had said finally. It was terrifying, and there were moments I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd stayed silent. And everything that came after, this job, Josie getting proper medical care, feeling like I'm doing work that matters, none of that would have happened if I hadn't taken that chance. Beverly had stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What if I told you that stopping the funeral wasn't the biggest risk you could take? She had asked softly. What if I told you there was something even scarier you could do, but it might be worth it? Trevor's heart had started racing, sensing where this was going, but not quite believing it. What would that be? Beverly had taken a breath, and for the first time since he had known her, she had looked vulnerable. You could tell me how you really feel about me, she had said, because I know how I feel about you. And it's terrifying because you work for me and you saved my life, and there's this massive power imbalance and 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea. But I can't stop thinking about you, Trevor, and I need to know if I'm alone in that, or if you feel it too. Trevor had stared at her, his mind racing through all the reasons this was impossible. She was his boss. She was a billionaire. She was beautiful and brilliant and way out of his league. People would say he was using her, that he was after her money, that he had saved her life just to manipulate her into a relationship. But standing there in the glow of the city lights, watching Beverly Whitmore look at him with hope and fear in her eyes, Trevor had realized something important. Love wasn't about logistics, or what other people thought, or whether the circumstances were perfect. Love was about choosing someone despite the complications, about taking a risk, because the alternative, living without trying, was worse than any failure. I'm falling in love with you, Trevor had said, the words coming out in a rush before he could second-guess them. I've been trying not to because it seemed crazy and presumptuous, and like I was reading too much into things. But yes, Beverly, I feel it too. I feel it so much, it keeps me up at night wondering if I'm being an idiot for even hoping you might feel the same way. Beverly had laughed, relief and joy flooding her face. You're not an idiot, she had said, stepping closer. You're the bravest man I know. You stopped a funeral to save someone you barely knew. Surely admitting you have feelings isn't scarier than that. Trevor had smiled, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. You'd be surprised. Stopping the funeral was one moment of courage. This is choosing to be vulnerable every day. They had kissed there on the riverfront, tentative at first, and then deeper, years of loneliness and caution falling away as they allowed themselves to imagine a future together. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. There were too many complications for that. Trevor worried constantly about people thinking he was with Beverly for her money. Beverly struggled with trust after Kenneth's betrayal, sometimes pulling away when things got too intense, only to apologize later for letting her trauma control her reactions. They had long conversations about how to navigate their professional relationship now that they were personally involved, ultimately deciding that transparency was key. Beverly made sure the board knew about their relationship and recused herself from decisions about Trevor's compensation or position. Trevor worked twice as hard to prove he had earned his role on merit, not because he was dating the CEO. But despite the challenges, their relationship grew stronger. Josie adored Beverly, and Beverly was wonderful with Josie, never trying to replace her mother, but simply being a caring adult presence in her life. The three of them developed their own rhythms, weekend breakfasts, where Josie would chatter about school and friends, while Beverly and Trevor exchanged glances over their coffee cups, movie nights, where they would argue about which films to watch, trips to the park where Beverly would push Josie on the swings, and Trevor would feel his heart expand with the simple joy of having a family that felt whole. When Josie asked if Beverly was going to be her new mom, Trevor had carefully explained that relationships were complicated, and they were taking things slowly. Josie had considered this seriously before announcing that she thought Beverly should definitely be her new mom because she was nice and smart and made her dad smile more than he used to. A year after they had started dating, Trevor had taken Beverly to the cemetery where he had worked, where he had overheard the conversation that changed all their lives. They had walked to the spot where her funeral had taken place, the ground now just another patch of grass among thousands of graves. "I think about that day all the time," Beverly had said quietly. "About how close I came to actually being buried here. About how different everything would be if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up." Trevor had squeezed her hand. "I think about it too. About how my whole life changed in that moment. How Josie's life changed. How we went from barely surviving to actually thriving. All because I did the right thing at the right time." They had stood there for a long moment before Beverly spoke again. "I have something to ask you. And I'm going to do it here because this place represents the moment we both chose to fight for what mattered." She had reached into her pocket and pulled out a small box, and Trevor's breath had caught in his throat. "Trevor Hayes, you saved my life when you had every reason to stay silent. You showed me what real integrity looks like. You made me believe that good people exist and that love doesn't have to come with betrayal. I know this is unconventional, and I know people will have opinions about a woman proposing to a man, especially when that woman happens to be wealthy, and that man used to work for minimum wage. But I don't care about conventional, and I definitely don't care about people's opinions. I care about you and about Josie and about building a life with both of you. So I'm asking, will you marry me?" Trevor had dropped to his knees beside her, laughing and crying at the same time. "I was supposed to ask you," he had said. "I've been saving up for a ring for months. I had this whole plan about taking you to the hospital where we first met and proposing where you told Josie about hearts being strong." Beverly had smiled through her own tears. "We can still do that if you want. You can propose to me tomorrow, and I'll say yes. But right now, I'm asking you, and I really need to know your answer because I'm in danger of getting grass stains on these very expensive pants." Trevor had pulled her down beside him, both of them kneeling on the ground where she had almost been buried, where he had almost let fear stop him from doing the right thing. "Yes," he had said. "Yes to everything. To you, to us. To building something real and messy and complicated and beautiful." They had gotten married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the hospital where they had first met. Josie had been the flower girl, wearing a dress she had picked out herself and carrying a bouquet of flowers that matched Beverly's. Ruth Whitmore had walked Beverly down the aisle, tears streaming down her face as she gave her niece to the man who had saved her life. The ceremony had been simple and short, focusing not on the wealth or status of the bride, but on the love and commitment of two people who had found each other through tragedy and chosen to build something better. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Josie had piped up in her clear child's voice, "I object to anyone who tries to stop this because they're perfect together, and I already picked out where we should put Miss Beverly's stuff in our apartment." The reception had been held in the hospital's atrium, a choice that had confused some guests, but made perfect sense to Trevor and Beverly. This was where it had all started, where Beverly had shown kindness to a stranger's sick child, where Trevor had first learned that sometimes the wealthy and powerful were capable of genuine compassion. The speeches had been short and heartfelt. Ruth had talked about Beverly's resilience and Trevor's courage. Josie had given a speech she had written herself about how dads and hearts and Miss Beverly were all magic in their own ways. And Trevor had stood up, his hand shaking slightly as he held the microphone, and thanked everyone for coming to celebrate a love story that had started in the darkest possible way and had somehow become the brightest thing in his life. A year and a half ago, I was a man who cleaned graves and lived in a maintenance shed, Trevor had said, his voice carrying across the atrium. I was barely keeping my daughter alive, barely keeping myself together, barely believing that life could ever be more than just surviving one day at a time. Then I overheard a conversation that forced me to make a choice. Stay silent and safe, or speak up and risk everything. I chose to speak up, not because I was brave, but because someone I loved needed me to be brave. And that choice led me here, to this moment, to this incredible woman who sees value in people that society overlooks, who believes in second chances and hard work, and the possibility that good can win even when evil has all the power. He had turned to Beverly, his eyes locked on hers. You told my daughter that hearts are stronger than people think, that they keep fighting even when everything else wants to give up. You were right. Your heart kept fighting when you were trapped in that casket. My heart kept fighting through years of poverty and fear. And now our hearts are fighting together, building a life that neither of us could have imagined. I love you, Beverly Whitmore. I love your courage, your kindness, your brilliant mind, and your stubborn insistence on making the world better, even when it would be easier to just make money. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, worth believing in, worth loving. I promise to spend the rest of my life being the man you think I am. There hadn't been a dry eye in the room. Even the hospital staff who had wandered in to see what the celebration was about had found themselves wiping away tears. Beverly had stood and wrapped her arms around Trevor, whispering in his ear that she loved him too, that he was already everything she needed him to be, that they were going to build something beautiful together. And they had. In the months and years that followed, Trevor and Beverly became known, not just for their unusual love story, but for their work together, making Vantage Industries into a company that proved profit. And ethics didn't have to be opposing forces. They developed medical devices that were affordable and effective. They partnered with hospitals in underserved communities. They funded scholarships for kids like Josie, who had chronic health conditions and needed support to pursue their dreams of working in medicine. Josie grew up healthy and strong. Her heart condition managed so well that by the time she was 16, her doctors were calling her their miracle patient. She volunteered at the same hospital where she had first met Beverly, reading to sick kids and telling them stories about hearts being stronger than people think. She never forgot where she came from or how close she had come to losing her father to despair. She carried that knowledge with her always, let it shape her into someone who understood that kindness could change everything, that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest acts, a kind word to a stranger in a hospital waiting room, a decision to speak up when silence would be easier, could ripple outward in ways you could never predict. Trevor never returned to the cemetery where he had worked, where he had overheard the conversation that changed his life. He didn't need to. He carried that moment with him always, not as trauma, but as a reminder that he had been brave when it mattered most. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Beverly gave him a gift that made him cry, a framed photograph of the hospital atrium where they had gotten married, with a plaque that read, "Where courage and love began." They hung it in their home office, right across from Trevor's desk, so he would see it every day when he came to work. A reminder that the poorest man at a funeral had become the richest man in the world, not because of money, but because he had chosen truth over silence, action over fear, and love over every logical reason why it shouldn't work. The story of how Trevor Hayes stopped Beverly Whitmore's funeral eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. But for those who had been there that autumn day, for those who had watched a cemetery worker in a dirt-stained uniform risk everything to save a woman he barely knew, the memory remained vivid. They told the story to their children and grandchildren a modern parable about courage and integrity, and the power of choosing right over easy. And sometimes, late at night, when Trevor couldn't sleep, he would think about that moment when he had stepped out from behind the maintenance building and walked toward the grave. He would remember the weight of fear, the certainty that he was about to destroy his life, and the stronger certainty that staying silent would destroy his soul. He had chosen courage. He had chosen truth. He had chosen to believe that one person speaking up could make a difference, even against wealth and power, and a conspiracy that seemed unbreakable. And he had been right. Not because the universe rewarded good behavior. Trevor had been poor and good for too many years to believe that. But because in that moment, his choice had mattered. Beverly had lived. Kenneth had faced justice. And a little girl named Josie had learned that her father really was the hero she believed him to be. Everything else, the job, the love, the life they had built together, was just proof that sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, the universe decides to stand up for you too. Years later, when reporters asked Beverly what she thought about the day Trevor saved her life, she always gave the same answer. "He didn't just save my life that day," she would say. "He saved my faith in humanity. He proved that good people still exist, that courage isn't reserved for those with power and privilege, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else has overlooked." Trevor Hayes was invisible to most people at that funeral, but he was the only one who saw what mattered, the only one who valued truth more than comfort. He's my hero, not because he stopped my burial, but because he represents everything I believe about what human beings can be when they choose integrity over convenience. And Trevor, when asked what he thought about being called a hero, would shake his head and smile. "I'm not a hero," he would say. "I'm just a dad who wanted to teach his daughter that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Beverly was the one who taught me that hearts are stronger than people think. I just proved she was right about mine."